A very good morning to you everybody. Welcome you all for this session 22. In this session, we will learn about scleronomic and rheonomic types of constraints. So let's have a recap of what we have studied in previous classes. Constraint. The limitation or restriction imposed on the motion of a body is called as constraint, and they're known as constraint motion. Based on the constraint motion equation, we classify them into holonomic and non-holonomic constraint. If the constraint motion can be expressed in the form of an equation, we call it as holonomic constraint. If we cannot express the constraint motion in the form of an equation, it is known as non-holonomic constraints. In this session, we will continue with the types of constraints. The learning objective of this session is to understand what do you mean by scleronomic and rheonomic type of constraints. By the end of this session, you will come to know what do you mean by scleronomic and rheonomic constraints. Rheonomic constraint. If the constraint motion equation contains the time as explicit variable, we call it as rheonomic constraints. Example number 1, a simple pendulum with varying length. Number 2, a bead on a uniformly rotating wire. Number 3, deformable bodies. Number 4, gas expansion or contraction filled in a container. If the equation of a constraint motion does not contain time as explicit variable, we call it as scleronomic constraint. Example, a rigid body. Number 2, a pendulum with a fixed support. Number 3, a gas-filled hollow sphere. In this slide, we have some restricted motion. A pendulum with varying length is an example for rheonomic constraint. Deformable body is an example for rheonomic constraint. Gas expansion or contraction in a container is an example for rheonomic constraint. A bead sliding on a uniformly rotating wire is an example of rheonomic constraint. A rigid body, pendulum with a fixed support, and a gas-filled hollow sphere, all these are all examples of scleronomic type of constraints. So in this session, we learned what do you mean by rheonomic constraint and what do you mean by scleronomic constraint. If the equation of a constraint motion contains time as explicit variable, we call it as rheonomic constraint. If the equation of a constraint motion does not contain time as explicit variable, we call it as scleronomic type of constraint. Now let's have a small MCQ session. Question number 1. Which constraint equation of a motion are independent of time? It is scleronomic. Question 2. Which constraint equation of motion are time dependent? It is Rheonomic constraint. The constraint of a bead on a uniformly rotating wire in a force-free space is an example of Rheonomic constraint. Constraint in a rigid body is an example of scleronomic constraint. Question number 5. Pendulum with varying length is an example of Rheonomic constraint. Question 6. A pendulum with a fixed support is an example of scleronomic constraint. Question number 7. A gas-filled allosphere is an example of scleronomic constraint. Question number 8. Deformable bodies is an example of Rheonomic constraints. Question number 9. Gas expansion or contraction filled in a container is an example of Rheonomic constraint. Question number 10. A box sliding on a moving inclined plane is an example of Rheonomic constraints. So students, in this session we learned scleronomic and rheonomic types of constraints. So in the last 2 sessions we learned about constraints, types of constraint motion. Hope you enjoyed these sessions. Thank you all.